Summer 1991, somewhere outside a packed nightclub called Studio West, Thelma Wright lay low behind a metal dumpster while gunshots cracked across the parking lot. She pressed flat against cold concrete, staring straight into twin shotgun barrels, not knowing which move would end everything she built across Philadelphia and Los Angeles. By then, she had money stacked, enemies circling, plus a name floating heavy through both coasts. But that night was not the beginning. Since years earlier, she was just another church girl walking South Philly blocks nobody expected would ever get this dark. Long before people called her boss lady or Queen Pen, Thelma Wright grew up inside a strict Catholic household planted deep in South Philadelphia, where routine mattered more than reputation. Her parents ran a tight home, pushing discipline, church attendance, homework, plus manners that carried through classrooms and neighborhood sidewalks alike. She attended Catholic schools like St. Maria Goretti High School, moving through hallways filled with uniforms, rosaries, and strict teachers who believed structure could shape destiny. That early environment planted order inside her thinking, which later made people shocked when they learned how far she would drift from those beginnings. Inside that household, education held real weight, so conversations stayed centered around grades, future plans, stable careers that could lift someone beyond row house life. By the time she reached Temple University in North Philadelphia, she already carried ambitions tied to real estate management, plus dreams shaped by watching people flip properties across the city. Temple during the late 70s felt alive with change, blending activism, street energy, students hustling between lectures while the city itself shifted underneath them. While she studied property markets, she also watched neighborhoods evolve, learning how money moved differently depending on who controlled certain blocks. Yet outside classrooms, South Philly streets carried another kind of education that never showed up in textbooks, especially through the neighborhood numbers game circulating quietly among working families. Back then, legal lotteries barely existed, so policy slips passed hand to hand, with the runners collecting bets from barbershops, corner stores, even church steps after Sunday service. Thelma noticed women playing roles inside that underground system, handling ledgers, tracking payouts, moving discreetly without flashy attention. Observing that environment planted early understanding that money could travel sideways through unofficial routes while still looking ordinary from the outside. Late 70s. Philadelphia carried economic tension that shaped young minds without them realizing it, especially as factories closed while unemployment crept higher across black neighborhoods. You could walk one block and seeing boarded storefronts, then another corner where someone pulled up in a fresh Cadillac with gold chains swinging under streetlights. That contrast left an impression on many teenagers who wondered how certain people skipped traditional ladders while still living comfortably. Thelma watched closely but stayed quiet, absorbing patterns instead of chasing attention, which later helped her move differently from louder personalities around her. Her upbringing never pushed rebellion, so friends remembered her as observant rather than reckless, someone who paid attention before making moves. She dressed clean, stayed athletic, and kept herself grounded in routines shaped by family expectations, which made her seem unlikely to drift toward underworld circles. Even when she later traveled to Los Angeles, chasing fashion ventures and small business ideas, she carried that same composed presence that blended easily into professional environments. People who met her during those years often described someone calm, soft-spoken, never broadcasting ambition loudly across crowded rooms. Still, environments shape trajectories slowly, especially when attraction grows toward individuals living louder lives than your own careful path ever allowed. Around her early 20s, returning to Philadelphia after time on the West Coast, she crossed paths with a man whose lifestyle moved on a completely different frequency. His name was Howard Jackie Wright, a figure already known in local circles connected to the heroin trade running through South Philly corridors. That meeting did not feel historic at first, yet it quietly pulled her toward an orbit that would rewrite everything she thought she understood about survival. When Thelma Wright met Howard Jackie Wright in the late 1970s, she stepped into a world that already moved faster than anything she had known growing up in South Philadelphia. Jackie carried himself with quiet confidence, the type of presence that turned heads without him raising his voice or forcing attention. People in neighborhood circles recognized his name, not from loud street corners, but from whispers tied to deeper operations feeding heroin across the city. Unlike short-term hustlers chasing quick flips, Jackie operated several layers above, dealing with weight that rarely touched open-air markets. His reputation was loosely connected to networks often labeled under the Black Mafia umbrella, a loose affiliation of traffickers who controlled major narcotics flow through Philadelphia during that era. That connection gave him reach stretching beyond local blocks, linking suppliers, distributors, plus protection channels that insulated him from everyday street chaos. Jackie did not linger outside liquor stores counting cash in public, since most transactions happened behind closed doors where decisions carried heavier consequences. That style made him intriguing to outsiders, especially someone like Thelma, who had mostly seen smaller hustles rather than organized pipelines. Their connection formed gradually, rooted in attraction shaped by lifestyle, ambition, plus a sense of protection that felt different from anything she experienced before. Jackie dressed sharply, drove clean cars, and moved through restaurants like someone who understood power without needing validation from strangers. For a young woman raised around discipline, yet surrounded by economic struggle, that confidence looked like stability rather than danger. He showed her a version of success that bypassed corporate ladders, offering access to private dinners, tailored outfits, plus environments where money seemed limitless. As their relationship deepened, Thelma found herself navigating dual realities that rarely overlapped, since daylight hours still reflected a composed young woman, while nights introduced spaces filled with coded conversations. One moment she attended family gatherings grounded in church values. Then later she might sit beside Jackie during meetings where language shifted into guarded tones. Those transitions did not feel dramatic at first, partly since Jackie shielded herself from direct exposure to violence that fueled his income streams. Still, subtle clues surfaced, especially through how people treated him with careful respect rather than casual friendliness. By the time they married, that dual life settled into routine patterns that blended affection with unspoken tension, creating a bond shaped by loyalty as much as dependence. Their son Jackie arrived in 1982, bringing moments of genuine joy that softened the edges surrounding Jackie's dangerous world. Photographs from that period showed a smiling couple holding their child, projecting an image that looked almost ordinary from the outside. Yet behind those pictures lived realities few neighbors fully understood, since money flowing into their home came tied to risks that never truly disappeared. Domestic life carried contradictions that became harder to ignore as years passed, especially when love collided with control shaped by Jackie's environment. Thelma later admitted that moments of abuse entered their relationship, including incidents where arguments escalated beyond words into physical harm. She described tolerating certain behaviors partly from fear, partly from attachment to the man she believed protected her within unpredictable surroundings. That tension reflected a familiar pattern within criminal ecosystems, where affection often mixed uneasily with dominance shaped by power dynamics. Despite those fractures, Jackie still functioned as a provider, ensuring their household stayed insulated from struggles hitting surrounding neighborhoods during the early 1980s. He invested in legitimate fronts, including clothing ventures like Jackie M Enterprises, allowing Thelma to explore business interests that looked lawful on paper. Through those ventures, she gained exposure to supply chains, retail strategies, plus networking skills that extended beyond Philadelphia's tight corridors. That experience quietly expanded her confidence, teaching her that enterprise could operate through many forms if someone understood structure. By the mid-80s, pressure building inside Philadelphia's drug landscape began pushing certain figures to reposition themselves geographically, especially as rivalries intensified across overlapping territories. Jackie decided to relocate parts of their life to Los Angeles, hoping distance would provide breathing room from escalating tensions back east. The move introduced Thelma to West Coast rhythms, where fashion, entertainment, plus emerging cocaine markets created different atmospheres from Philly's heroin-dominated scene. California offered sunshine and opportunity on the surface, yet the networks Jackie tapped into there carried their own undercurrents. Living between coasts exposed her to broader operations, since Jackie's connections extended into distribution channels stretching beyond single neighborhoods. She watched how relationships formed across cities, noticing how trust functioned like currency stronger than written contracts. Business discussions happened in hotel suites, private homes, and sometimes upscale restaurants, where conversations sounded casual to outsiders, yet carried coded meaning. Those experiences shaped her understanding of scale, revealing how organized trafficking moved through layers rather than simple hand-to-hand exchanges. During those years, she absorbed lessons indirectly, not as an active participant, yet certainly not untouched by what surrounded her daily life. Jackie often kept operational details compartmentalized, though proximity still allowed her to observe behavioral patterns tied to leadership within underground markets. She saw how he handled disputes quietly, preferring negotiation over public displays that could attract attention. That calm demeanor reinforced her perception that success in that world depended more on discipline than chaos, a belief that would later influence her own decisions. Still, behind luxury and travel, danger lingered like background static that never fully faded, especially when news surfaced about shootings or arrests tied to similar circles. Jackie maintained composure publicly, yet private conversations sometimes hinted at threats growing closer each year. Rivals expanded territories, law enforcement tightened investigations, while loyalties inside networks shifted without warning. Those realities reminded anyone paying attention that longevity inside that lifestyle rarely stretched indefinitely. For Thelma, those signals created quiet anxiety she rarely voiced openly, though instincts warned that stability built on underground economies could crumble suddenly. She balanced motherhood, business interests, plus marriage within a landscape shaped by unpredictability that no amount of money could fully neutralize. Even celebrations carried undertones, since every success story within that environment seemed paired with cautionary endings. Looking back later, she acknowledged that prosperity during those years existed alongside shadows growing longer each season. What she did not fully grasp yet was how fragile that balance truly remained, especially for someone positioned at the center of expanding narcotics networks. That reality hung unspoken over their lives, setting the stage for a turning point neither could delay much longer. In August 1986, everything holding Thelma Wright's life together cracked in a way no warning could soften or prepare her mind for. News spread fast across Philadelphia that Howard Jackie Wright had been found murdered, his body discovered with a gunshot wound rolled tightly inside a rug. The killing carried the cold signature of organized retaliation, not random street chaos, which made it instantly clear this was no ordinary loss. For people who understood how those networks operated, the message behind that murder felt louder than the act itself. For Thelma, the shock did not arrive in waves like television dramas often show, since reality hit with blunt force that refused to slow down. One moment, she was a young mother managing routines shaped around family life. Then suddenly she stood alone, facing questions nobody could answer for her. Their son Jackiam was still small, barely old enough to grasp why his father stopped coming home after that summer. The emotional fallout blended grief with fear, creating a pressure that few people outside that world could fully understand. Stories started circulating immediately, especially rumors claiming Jackie must have left hidden millions tucked away somewhere she could access. People outside those circles assumed drug figures always secured secret fortunes ready for emergencies or disappearances. That myth followed her everywhere, shaping how neighbors, acquaintances, and even distant relatives interpreted her situation. In reality, she later explained that no giant vault appeared, leaving uncertainty hanging heavier than most expected. That gap between perception and truth forced her into a psychological corner where choices felt brutally limited, despite outside assumptions. Walking away completely meant starting over with little protection, raising a child while navigating environments already aware of her past connections. Stepping forward into Jackie's world meant embracing dangers she had only observed from the edges before that point. Neither option offered comfort, which turned decision-making into something deeper than ambition or pride. Inside those weeks after the funeral, pressure quietly formed from multiple directions, some spoken openly, others implied through silence. Associates connected to Jackie's network still existed, unsure who would stabilize operations now that their central figure disappeared. Loose alliances depended on continuity, since supply chains did not pause for mourning periods or personal healing. That reality created expectations hovering around her even when nobody directly demanded she step up. Gradually, she began recognizing that Jackie's operation functioned like machinery, still running after its operator vanished suddenly. Connections stretched from Philadelphia corridors toward West Coast channels, involving suppliers, couriers, and distributors who depended on steady coordination. If leadership dissolved overnight, those same relationships could turn volatile, sometimes dangerous for anyone loosely tied to the structure. That understanding shifted her thinking from emotional reaction toward calculated assessment. Her internal conflict deepened during that period, shaped by memories of what she already knew about loyalty inside underground economies. Walking away could look like betrayal to some individuals who measure respect differently than traditional society. Remaining passive risked vulnerability, especially if rivals assumed Jackie's death, created an open vacuum worth exploiting quickly. Those calculations moved quietly through her mind, shaping a mindset focused less on revenge and more on survival. When she later spoke about that turning point, she rarely framed it like a glamorous rise into power, choosing instead language centered on necessity. She described looking at her child, then looking at the reality surrounding her, realizing inaction might invite consequences she could not control. That perspective reframed everything, turning grief into fuel for decisions rooted in protection rather than ego. Survival logic replaced emotional hesitation, guiding steps she never imagined taking years earlier. Street expectations also played subtle roles during that transformation, especially within environments where reputations carried long memories. People familiar with Jackie's standing understood his absence would ripple through circles that thrived on continuity. Some quietly wondered whether his wife would disappear from that world entirely or step into spaces few women occupied at that scale. Those unspoken questions created a backdrop shaping how she evaluated her next move. As days turned into months, she began recognizing that stepping forward offered at least some level of control over unpredictable outcomes. Taking charge meant shaping decisions herself instead of reacting to forces moving without her input. That distinction mattered deeply within environments where hesitation often invited exploitation. Control, even limited, felt safer than drifting through uncertainty without direction. Her identity shifted gradually, almost unnoticed at first, transitioning from grieving wife towards someone forced into leadership by circumstances she never requested. Friends who watched closely noticed changes in how she carried herself, especially in conversations involving logistics or planning. Where uncertainty once filled her tone, measured confidence slowly replaced it as she adjusted mentally. That evolution marked a psychological crossing that few fully understood until much later. Importantly, that transition did not erase grief or emotional scars tied to losing her husband so violently. Instead, those feelings settled underneath decisions she now made with clearer purpose, shaped by harsh realities. She carried memories of Jackie alongside awareness that survival required stepping into territory she once observed cautiously. That duality defined her transformation more than any romanticized narrative ever could. Once the dust settled after Jackie Wright's death, Thelma stepped into motion with a focus shaped more by calculation than emotion. She began reconnecting with people who once dealt directly with her husband, rebuilding lines that still existed but lacked coordination. Those connections stretched across Philadelphia neighborhoods where trust mattered more than contracts or paperwork. Instead of announcing herself loudly, she approached conversations carefully, letting familiarity open doors that strangers could never access. That method helped her stabilize foundations before expanding outward into something much larger. Philadelphia remained her anchor, yet she understood early that real strength required reaching beyond a single city's borders. Jackie had already established links between the East Coast and California, giving her a framework she could rebuild instead of inventing from nothing. She leaned into that blueprint, gradually restoring bi-coastal movement between Philadelphia and Los Angeles, where demand never seemed to slow. West Coast contacts still respected Jackie's name, which gave her an entry point even while she forged her own reputation. That balance between inheritance and reinvention became central to her rise. Among those connections stood a man she later referred to simply as D, a West Coast trafficker who would shape her operational evolution. Their partnership blended business with familiarity, since both understood what surviving inside that ecosystem demanded. He specialized in cocaine flows across California circuits, while she controlled heroin routes tied back to Philadelphia. Together, they formed an exchange system that widened both their reach without attracting unnecessary attention. That collaboration helped her cement a bi-coastal structure capable of moving product efficiently across thousands of miles. Building that network required more than relationships, since logistics determined survival within a landscape shaped by surveillance and shifting loyalties. She studied shipping patterns, travel habits, plus behavioral cues that reduced suspicion across airports and delivery routes. Couriers became essential components, selected carefully for reliability rather than bravado or street reputation. Many traveled as ordinary passengers carrying luggage that blended into crowds moving through terminals daily. That subtlety allowed movement without drawing the kind of attention louder operations often triggered. Communication demanded equal discipline, especially during an era when law enforcement increased wiretaps and undercover infiltration nationwide. She leaned into coded language, avoiding direct conversations that could later surface as evidence in courtrooms. Meetings happened face-to-face whenever possible, keeping sensitive discussions away from recorded channels. Even casual conversations carried layers, since tone and phrasing mattered as much as content. That awareness turned communication into a craft she refined over time, rather than improvising recklessly. Shipping methods evolved alongside those communication strategies, since she refused to rely on predictable routines that investigators could map easily. Packages moved through legitimate services disguised among everyday cargo circulating across the country. Couriers carried money back along reverse routes, creating cycles that fed the system without leaving obvious trails. Flexibility became her shield, allowing adjustments whenever conditions shifted unexpectedly. That adaptability separated her operations from many contemporaries who relied too heavily on repetition. Despite commanding such complex movement, her leadership style stayed remarkably low profile compared to the stereotypes surrounding drug figures of that era. She rarely flaunted wealth publicly, preferring environments where she could blend into professional settings unnoticed. Associates described her demeanor as composed, almost corporate, which contrasted sharply with louder personalities chasing attention. That quiet presence made it harder for outsiders to categorize her within familiar criminal archetypes. Remaining understated became a strategic advantage that extended her longevity. Unlike many operators, she avoided carrying weapons personally, choosing instead to build layers of protection around herself. Trusted individuals handled security concerns, allowing her to maintain distance from direct violence whenever possible. That approach reduced exposure while reinforcing a perception that she operated more like an executive than a street enforcer. It also allowed her to move through varied spaces without projecting threat constantly. Safety existed through structure rather than intimidation alone. As the system matured, profits climbed steadily, eventually reaching levels that reshaped her lifestyle entirely. Estimates later suggested monthly earnings approaching hundreds of thousands, figures that placed her among the most successful traffickers operating quietly during that period. Those numbers did not emerge overnight, instead building gradually as routes stabilized and partnerships strengthened. Each successful cycle reinforced confidence within her network, expanding loyalty through demonstrated competence. Money became both a reward and reinforcement for strategies she refined carefully. With success came recognition, though it traveled through whispers rather than headlines or flashy displays. Within certain circles, she picked up names like Boss Lady and Queen Pen, labels reflecting respect shaped by results rather than marketing. Those nicknames carried weight precisely because she never chased them publicly, allowing reputation to form organically through performance. People who dealt with her understood that she handled business with consistency uncommon in volatile markets. Respect grew quietly, mirroring the way her empire expanded beneath the surface. What made her especially unique was the way she navigated two worlds without appearing out of place in either environment. One day, she could discuss property or business ventures in settings that felt entirely legitimate, then pivot into negotiations involving shipments moving across state lines. That ability to shift personas allowed her to exist between corporate and street ecosystems seamlessly. Few operators managed that balance without eventually leaning too far toward one side. She treated that duality like a skill set rather than a contradiction. Through all of it, she never presented herself as someone chasing fame or validation, instead focusing on stability within structures she built carefully. Her rise reflected methodical growth rather than explosive headlines, which ironically made her more formidable over time. In an industry dominated by men accustomed to visible dominance, her quiet command disrupted expectations subtly. She proved that authority could emerge through discipline instead of noise. By the late 1980s, she was thriving inside a world that rarely allowed women to lead. Yet she was doing exactly that without asking permission. By the late 1980s, the money started stacking in ways that changed everything around Thelma Wright's daily life, even though it never slowed the pace she kept. Success opened doors into environments far removed from the South Philadelphia blocks where her story began years earlier. Trips to Las Vegas became common, especially during heavyweight fight weekends that pulled traffickers, promoters, athletes, plus celebrities into the same arenas. Ringside seats, expensive outfits, plus champagne conversations created a world where wealth felt almost normal if someone stayed long enough. Yet beneath that polished surface, the same business feeding those luxuries never loosened its grip. Designer fashion entered her routine naturally, partly as a reward, partly as armor that matched the spaces she moved through regularly. She wore tailored outfits that blended into upscale restaurants where nobody asked too many questions about backgrounds. West Coast shopping trips introduced European labels that reflected the new financial reality she navigated daily. On some weekends, she could be spotted inside luxury boutiques in Los Angeles, then back in Philadelphia days later, managing operations quietly. That fluid movement between cities reinforced the scale she had reached without needing public recognition. Travel itself shifted into something smoother, sometimes involving private jets shared among wealthy associates who valued convenience over commercial schedules. Flights no longer revolved around ticket lines or crowded terminals, allowing conversations to continue uninterrupted across state lines. Those environments connected her to elite circles where business blended with entertainment effortlessly. People inside those spaces rarely introduced themselves with full histories, creating atmospheres built on discretion rather than curiosity. She learned quickly how to exist within those rooms while revealing as little as possible about herself. Despite those privileges, motherhood never paused, forcing her to balance dual realities that rarely aligned comfortably. Her son Jack Yim remained at the center of her decisions, even while operations demanded travel stretching across the country regularly. One week might involve school meetings in Philadelphia, then business trips pulling her toward California shortly afterward. She tried maintaining stability for him, creating routines that masked the scale of responsibilities she carried privately. That balancing act demanded emotional discipline, rarely visible from the outside. Raising a child while running an invisible empire required constant compartmentalization, since she refused to let those worlds collide openly. School events still mattered, parent conversations still happened, yet behind those normal interactions existed schedules mapped around shipments and meetings. She avoided bringing certain associates near her home life, building invisible boundaries, separating family space from everything else. That separation protected her son from exposure, though it increased the isolation she carried internally. Few people understood how heavy that balancing act became over time. While wealth expanded, paranoia crept in quietly, growing stronger each year as headlines filled with arrests tied to the escalating war on drugs. Federal investigations intensified nationwide, targeting trafficking networks with surveillance tools becoming more advanced. Stories about wiretaps, informants, plus sudden indictments circulated constantly through circles she trusted. Each new arrest reminded her that longevity in that world rarely came without consequences. Even success started carrying undertones that felt heavier than celebration. Sleepless nights became familiar, especially during periods when shipments moved across multiple states simultaneously. She would lie awake replaying details, wondering whether couriers reached destinations safely or whether unexpected stops might change everything overnight. That mental pressure never showed publicly, yet it shaped how she approached decisions afterward. Over time, rest turned into something brief rather than reliable, replaced by constant mental scanning for possible threats. Success demanded vigilance that never truly powered down. Phones became tools she treated cautiously, especially as reports surfaced about expanded surveillance capabilities used by federal agencies. She reduced conversations over lines whenever possible, preferring face-to-face meetings even when inconvenient. That habit narrowed her circle naturally, leaving only a handful of people she trusted with sensitive discussions. Relationships inside that environment depended less on friendship and more on proven loyalty tested repeatedly. The tighter her network became, the more isolated she sometimes felt internally. Law enforcement pressure intensified in the late 1980s, shaped by national policies that increased sentencing severity for drug convictions dramatically. Mandatory minimum laws created ripple effects that frightened even seasoned operators who once believed they could outmaneuver authorities indefinitely. Every indictment carried stories about decades-long sentences handed down quickly, sending shockwaves through trafficking circles. Those developments forced her to rethink strategies constantly, adjusting movement patterns to stay ahead of shifting enforcement tactics. The atmosphere surrounding her world grew heavier with each passing year. Leading men inside that environment created its own layer of tension, since gender dynamics rarely favored women commanding authority at high levels. Some associates respected her efficiency immediately, while others tested boundaries quietly before accepting her leadership fully. She learned how to assert control without theatrics, relying on competence rather than intimidation to maintain order. That approach earned respect gradually, though it also required emotional resilience rarely discussed openly. Navigating male-dominated structures demanded strength beyond operational intelligence alone. Even within elite spaces, subtle reminders surfaced that she existed as an exception rather than the norm among traffickers reaching that level. Conversations sometimes shifted when new people realized she controlled significant operations, revealing assumptions shaped by stereotypes. Instead of confronting every slight, she focused on results that spoke louder than perceptions surrounding her role. Over time, consistent performance erased many doubts that surfaced early on. Still, Carrying that weight added pressure invisible to outsiders admiring surface-level success. By the late 1980s, the atmosphere surrounding Thelma Wright's world started tightening in ways even seasoned operators could not ignore anymore. The national war on drugs pushed aggressively through cities like Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and New York, turning federal attention toward trafficking networks once considered untouchable. News broadcasts began highlighting large-scale indictments, showing familiar patterns where entire organizations collapsed almost overnight. Those headlines were not abstract stories anymore, since many names mentioned were people she either knew directly or recognized through overlapping connections. That shift made success feel less permanent than it once did. Arrests became more frequent across circles that previously moved with confidence, creating ripple effects that reached every level of distribution chains. Some associates disappeared quietly after raids, leaving unanswered calls and broken routines that signaled trouble without formal confirmation. Others faced violent outcomes tied to rivalries, escalating under increased pressure, proving danger no longer came from law enforcement alone. Each loss chipped away at the illusion of control that once surrounded her operations. Watching those changes unfold forced her to confront realities she had managed to outrun for years. Surveillance fears intensified during that era, especially as federal agencies expanded tools capable of tracking movements more precisely than before. Wiretaps, informants, and undercover stings became part of everyday conversations within trafficking circles, trying to adapt quickly. Restaurants that once felt neutral suddenly seemed risky if the wrong person occupied a nearby table. Even familiar meeting spots lost their comfort, turning routine interactions into calculated risks. Safe spaces shrank gradually, leaving fewer environments where business could happen without second-guessing surroundings. As pressure mounted, unpredictability spread through partnerships that once appeared stable, reshaping how trust functioned within that ecosystem. Suppliers who once delivered consistently began shifting schedules without warning, trying to stay ahead of investigations targeting known routes. Some distributors grew paranoid, cutting communication abruptly to protect themselves, leaving gaps that disrupted carefully built networks. Those changes forced constant adjustments, since reliability became rare inside an environment defined by fear. Stability started feeling temporary rather than foundational. Among those shifts, the arrest of her West Coast associate known as D struck especially hard, sending shockwaves through her operations instantly. D had been more than a supplier, functioning as a critical bridge connecting her East Coast network with California pipelines. Federal agents taking him into custody signaled that distance offered less protection than many believed previously. That moment carried a deeper meaning beyond losing a partner, since it exposed vulnerabilities stretching across every route she relied upon. Suddenly, the illusion that geography could shield operations faded quickly. His arrest forced immediate recalculations, since relationships built around mutual trust now faced new levels of uncertainty. Questions surfaced about who might cooperate with authorities, who might disappear quietly, and who might panic under pressure. Loyalty inside trafficking networks always carried conditions, yet increased enforcement amplified those cracks dramatically. People who once seemed dependable began acting cautiously, sometimes distancing themselves without explanation. That fragility made long-term planning harder than it had ever been before. Small mistakes started carrying consequences far larger than earlier in her career, especially as investigators targeted minor vulnerabilities to build larger cases. A missed package, a careless conversation, even a traffic stop could trigger chain reactions capable of unraveling entire structures. Stories circulated about arrests stemming from seemingly trivial errors that spiraled into multi-state prosecutions. Those examples served as constant reminders that perfection was nearly impossible over extended periods. Every decision suddenly felt heavier under that kind of scrutiny. For Thelma, those developments created a growing awareness that the system she mastered was shifting beneath her feet steadily. Strategies that once worked reliably now required constant revision as enforcement tactics evolved quickly. She began recognizing that longevity inside that world depended not just on intelligence, but also on timing beyond anyone's control. Even the most disciplined operators could fall once enough variables aligned against them. That realization planted seeds of doubt she could no longer ignore. At the same time, internal tension within networks intensified as competition sharpened under shrinking margins and rising risk. Some players became more aggressive, trying to secure profits before potential collapse, increasing volatility across already fragile alliances. Violence sometimes followed those shifts, reminding everyone involved how quickly business could turn personal. The balance between profit and survival started tilting dangerously, especially for those carrying larger operations. Every move required sharper calculation than before. She continued navigating that environment carefully, yet even her disciplined approach could not eliminate uncertainty growing across both coasts. Conversations with trusted associates increasingly revolved around contingency plans rather than expansion ideas. Growth no longer dominated discussions the way it once had, replaced by strategies focused on maintaining stability. That shift alone signaled how drastically conditions had changed within only a few years. Momentum that once felt unstoppable now moved cautiously. By the summer of 1991, pressure that had been building quietly around Thelma Wright's world finally started showing itself in ways she could not ignore anymore. The tension she felt throughout the late 1980s now moved from background noise into sharp, unavoidable moments. Every conversation carried weight, every movement required extra thought, every environment felt less predictable than before. She had survived years inside an unstable system, yet something about that summer felt different in ways she could not fully explain. It was not one event alone, but a sequence that slowly stripped away any illusion of control she still carried. The first warning came violently inside a nightclub called Studio West, a place that once felt like a casual stop rather than a battlefield waiting to unfold. That night, she arrived with friends expecting music, conversation, maybe a brief escape from the pressure shadowing her daily life. Instead, gunfire erupted suddenly, sending people diving toward floors, tables, or any cover within reach as chaos swallowed the room instantly. In those seconds, instinct replaced thought, forcing decisions that meant the difference between survival and finality. The scene shifted from celebration to survival without warning. As shots rang out, someone pulled her down toward the ground, dragging her behind a metal dumpster near the club's exterior. Lying flat against cold pavement, she lifted her eyes just enough to see twin barrels pointed directly at her face. That image burned into memory instantly, freezing time into a single moment stretched longer than reality allowed. She did not know who held the weapon, nor whether the next movement would be her last. For someone who spent years managing danger indirectly, that closeness shattered any remaining distance she once maintained from violence. Eventually, the gunfire stopped, yet survival did not feel like relief the way outsiders might expect in stories told later. When she stood up, the aftermath revealed something heavier than fear alone, especially once she realized someone close to her had not walked away. A friend who entered that club beside her would never leave it alive, caught in the same crossfire that nearly ended her own life. That loss transformed the incident from a personal scare into a permanent reminder of how random survival could be. For the first time, proximity to death felt personal rather than abstract. Before she could fully process that night, another blow followed from a completely different direction, proving danger did not always announce itself through gunfire. A trusted associate connected to her operations made a mistake involving a package that failed to arrive through the postal system. That single error triggered a chain reaction when the individual contacted authorities indirectly, drawing attention that investigators quickly pursued. Federal agents stepped in, leading to an arrest that exposed how fragile even disciplined systems could become under pressure. One miscalculation had now created consequences stretching far beyond a single shipment. That arrest struck deeper than losing product or money, since it revealed how vulnerable every connection inside her network had become. Trust that once felt solid suddenly appeared conditional under the right circumstances. If one mistake could unravel an entire relationship, then the stability she relied on for years might not exist anymore. The realization forced her to reevaluate assumptions she once treated as certainty. Control, which once defined her strength, started feeling more like an illusion shaped by favorable timing. Only weeks later, a third shock arrived that sealed the pattern forming around her life that summer. A supplier she depended on was executed by rivals, another violent end tied to conflicts she could not contain or predict. That killing sent a message louder than any warning she had received previously. Violence was no longer something happening around her, it was dismantling pieces of her world directly. Each loss now felt connected, forming a sequence too deliberate to ignore. Together, those three moments created a domino effect that destabilized everything she spent years building carefully. The nightclub shootout shattered her sense of physical distance from danger. The arrest revealed operational fragility she could not dismiss anymore. The supplier's execution confirmed that violence still ruled outcomes regardless of intelligence or discipline. One by one, pillars supporting her confidence started collapsing within months. That sequence forced clarity she had managed to postpone for years. For someone who once believed control could outmaneuver chaos, that realization cut deeper than any financial setback ever could. Power had allowed her to shape outcomes for a long time, yet now it became clear that influence could not rewrite certain realities. Money could open doors, command loyalty, buy time, yet it could not guarantee survival. That understanding shifted her perspective in ways no previous experience had managed. The illusion separating authority from vulnerability dissolved quickly during that season. As those events settled into memory, maternal instincts surfaced stronger than ever before, reshaping how she evaluated risk. Every decision now carried the image of her son waiting somewhere beyond the life she'd built carefully. The idea of leaving him without protection or guidance forced new priorities into focus. Survival stopped feeling like a personal challenge and started looking like a responsibility tied to motherhood. That shift quietly redirected how she measured every move afterward. Internally, a decision began forming, not announced loudly or shared openly with those around her. Instead, it developed slowly through reflection shaped by exhaustion, grief, plus awareness that patterns rarely reversed once they reached certain points. She started recognizing that survival might demand something she never considered seriously before. Not a new strategy, not expansion, but disappearance itself. That thought stayed private at first, yet it grew stronger with each passing week. After the chaos of 1991 settled into clarity, Thelma Wright did something almost unheard of within that world. She chose strategy over spectacle. Instead of running suddenly or staging some dramatic disappearance, she started planning an exit built around patience and precision. Years inside high-stakes environments had taught her that loud moves attracted consequences, especially when money still flowed through fragile alliances. So rather than announcing any shift, she began pulling back quietly, step by step, letting distance replace presence gradually. That approach reflected the same discipline that built her empire in the first place. The shutdown did not happen overnight, since pipelines stretching across Philadelphia and Los Angeles required careful dismantling. She started reducing shipments slowly, spacing out operations until patterns faded into the background. Couriers who once moved regularly noticed fewer calls, fewer assignments, fewer reasons to travel across familiar routes. Each adjustment happened subtly, avoiding sudden changes that might spark suspicion among partners watching closely. Over time, the momentum that once drove her network forward began slowing naturally without public explanation. Cutting ties required even more delicacy, especially within circles where loyalty often blended with paranoia unpredictably. Instead of confrontations or formal farewells, she allowed relationships to cool gradually, letting silence replace constant communication. Calls that once came daily became occasional, then rare, then non-existent without clear breaking points. That method helped her avoid triggering retaliation from individuals who might react badly to abrupt abandonment. Distance became her shield, allowing separation without igniting unnecessary conflict. At the same time, she handled the remaining inventory carefully, ensuring nothing lingered long enough to create exposure later. Product moved discreetly through trusted channels, converting weight into liquid assets she could carry beyond that life. No sudden dumps flooded markets, no reckless deals risked drawing attention from law enforcement or rivals. Everything unfolded quietly, mirroring the low-profile style that defined her leadership throughout the late 1980s. Even her exit followed the same controlled rhythm that once fueled her rise. What made her withdrawal remarkable was how cleanly she disappeared from networks that once revolved around her presence. No high-profile arrests marked the end. No raids exposed warehouses, no headlines framed her downfall publicly. One day, she simply stopped appearing in conversations, leaving associates unsure whether she relocated, retired, or shifted into new ventures. That silence created confusion across circles accustomed to dramatic endings. Without closure, speculation filled the vacuum she left behind. Street rumors started spreading quickly, since absence always invites storytelling within environments built on myth. Some believe she moved overseas. Others claim she reinvented herself through legitimate businesses somewhere far from Philadelphia. A few suspected she still operated quietly under different identities, unwilling to accept that someone could walk away entirely. Those whispers kept her name alive even as she faded physically from those spaces. Mystery replaced visibility almost instantly. Privately, the psychological adjustment proved harder than any logistical shutdown she executed carefully. Walking away meant releasing control over systems she once directed with confidence daily. The rush tied to movement, negotiation, decision-making faded slowly, leaving unfamiliar silence in its place. Power that once defined her identity suddenly felt distant, replaced by routines shaped around normal life again. That transition demanded emotional recalibration, that few former traffickers ever managed successfully. Financial reality changed just as dramatically, forcing her to confront a lifestyle shift few outsiders could fully imagine. The monthly income that once climbed into hundreds of thousands disappeared almost entirely within a short window. She stepped into legitimate work that paid modest salaries, eventually earning around $19,000 annually in early employment. That contrast highlighted how far she traveled between two completely different worlds. Wealth that once seemed endless gave way to budgets shaped by ordinary constraints. Yet within that drastic shift, she gained something rare that money never guaranteed during her peak years. Safety started feeling real in ways luxury never delivered, especially knowing her survival no longer depended on constant vigilance. Ordinary routines replaced emergency planning, allowing space for reflection she postponed for years. Life slowed down, revealing possibilities she once ignored while navigating relentless pressure. That quiet stability carried value she learned to recognize gradually. Once she stepped away from that life in the early 1990s, reintegration did not arrive as some smooth transition wrapped in relief. Normal routines felt unfamiliar after years shaped by constant pressure, secrecy, plus decisions carrying heavy consequences. She moved carefully through ordinary environments, adjusting slowly to spaces where nobody expected coded conversations or hidden meanings. The absence of chaos felt strange at first, forcing her to relearn rhythms most people take for granted daily. That period became less about reinvention and more about relearning how to exist quietly again. Real estate offered one of the first stable paths forward, partly due to interests she carried long before the streets ever shaped her identity. She began working within property management roles, building credibility step by step inside legitimate systems that valued patience over speed. Paychecks felt modest compared to past earnings, yet each one represented something she had not known in years. Consistency without fear attached. That slow rebuilding process demanded humility she rarely needed during her earlier peak. Still, she stayed committed. Understanding stability required time rather than shortcuts. Emotionally, the aftermath of living two lives settled deeper than financial adjustments alone could explain. Memories from both worlds lingered, blending pride, regret, and relief into feelings difficult to categorize cleanly. She carried experiences that few around her could relate to, which sometimes created distance even inside ordinary conversations. Processing that duality became a private journey shaped by reflection rather than public confession. Over time, that internal work laid the groundwork for something she had not expected to share openly. Years later, she decided to write a memoir titled "With Eyes from Both Sides," placing her story into words that forced deeper honesty. The process required confronting moments she once compartmentalized just to survive emotionally. Writing allowed her to explore contradictions inside her journey, from ambition shaped by survival to regret tied to consequences she later understood more clearly. That book became more than storytelling, functioning almost like a bridge between past decisions and present clarity. It also opened doors she had not planned originally. Once her story reached readers, invitations followed for speaking engagements where audiences wanted to hear directly from someone who lived on both sides. She began addressing topics rarely discussed openly, including domestic abuse inside criminal relationships, psychological costs of fast money, plus survival instincts shaped by fear. Those conversations carried weight since they came from lived experience rather than distant observation. She spoke in prisons, schools, and community programs, bringing realism into spaces where myths often replace truth. That shift gradually turned her into a voice rather than a shadow. Out of that momentum, she founded the Thelma Wright Foundation, aiming to redirect lessons from her past into prevention for others. The organization focused especially on young women vulnerable to manipulation within street environments, promising protection or quick wealth. Through workshops, mentorship, plus outreach, she tried offering perspectives she wished someone had shared with her earlier. Programs also extended into correctional facilities, connecting with incarcerated women navigating consequences she understood deeply. That work reshaped how many people perceived her story moving forward. Her message rarely glorified anything tied to the drug trade, instead dismantling myths that still attract curiosity today. She spoke plainly about the illusion of freedom attached to fast money, explaining how fear often shadows every reward. That anti-glamour perspective resonated strongly, especially with younger audiences exposed to media portraying crime as glamorous rebellion. By sharing realities behind polished narratives, she reframed conversations surrounding survival choices. The goal was not judgment, but clarity rooted in lived truth. Media attention followed naturally as documentaries, interviews, plus articles revisited her past through new lenses. Programs like Gangsters, America's Most Evil, introduced her story to wider audiences unfamiliar with Philadelphia's drug era. Discussions about television adaptations surfaced as producers explored dramatizing her life for modern viewers. That exposure fueled cultural fascination surrounding queenpins, figures who disrupt expectations inside male-dominated crime stories. Her name began circulating within pop culture spaces she once avoided entirely. Still, public perception remained layered, refusing to settle into simple labels people often prefer. Some viewed her as proof of redemption, someone who escaped cycles that destroyed many others. Others remained skeptical, questioning whether transformation could erase damage tied to earlier choices. She rarely pushed back against either perspective directly, understanding that complexity rarely fits clean narratives. That ambiguity defined her presence more than any single interpretation. Looking back, what makes Thelma Wright's story stand apart is not simply that she rose inside a dangerous world, but that she exited it alive. Crime history holds countless names tied to empires built quickly, then erased through prison sentences or violent endings. Her path diverged sharply from that pattern, leaving observers searching for explanations that rarely feel complete. Surviving both the rise and the exit created a narrative few examples can match. That rarity alone keeps her story circulating decades later. Her leadership also challenged assumptions surrounding gender inside criminal ecosystems traditionally dominated by men. She commanded operations stretching across coasts without relying on theatrics often associated with power in those environments. That dynamic reshaped conversations about how authority can exist quietly, yet effectively. Even critics acknowledged the significance of that shift within underground hierarchies. Her presence complicated stereotypes that many people once accepted without question. Compared to peers from that era, her outcome feels almost improbable when measured against typical trajectories. Many traffickers connected to similar networks either died young or disappeared into decades-long sentences. She avoided both endings, which continues fueling debate around timing, instinct, plus luck shaping survival. Some credit discipline, others attribute faith, while skeptics insist chance played the largest role. That uncertainty keeps discussions around her life unsettled even today. Cultural impact continues evolving as new generations encounter her story through documentaries, articles, plus ongoing development talks about dramatized adaptations. Producers remain drawn to narratives where power intersects with redemption without predictable conclusions. Public reactions still vary widely, ranging from admiration toward resilience to criticism rooted in harm caused during her earlier years. That spectrum reflects broader tensions surrounding how society interprets transformation. No single viewpoint has ever fully defined her legacy. Meanwhile, her ongoing outreach keeps her connected to communities still navigating choices she understands personally. Youth programs, prison visits, and mentorship efforts ensure her influence extends beyond storytelling into practical intervention. Those initiatives reinforce that her journey did not end with the survival alone. It continues through attempts to redirect others away from paths she once walked herself. That ongoing work anchors her legacy in action rather than nostalgia. In the end, survival remains the thread tying everything together when her story is viewed from beginning to end. The same woman who once lay on cold pavement outside a nightclub staring into shotgun barrels eventually outlived the world that created that moment. Time carried her far beyond environments where fear once shaped every decision. That distance reframes the meaning of victory entirely. She did not conquer the streets in some dramatic final act. She simply lived long enough to leave them behind.